High instances, and this was the old coronavirus variant, don't forget, the original coronavirus, the proper one. And we knew that we had to do something. So we said to government, okay, we'll look at tier 2 restrictions, because that's what Manchester were in. We'll look at tier 2 restrictions. And then I negotiated a package of support for those tier 2 restrictions, which meant that we could support the businesses that would see reduced footfall, but basically it was still, the economy was basically still open. It was just pubs that didn't sell food that were having to close and other things. Within about a week of having those conversations, the Guardian, I think it was, or the Times, had a front page, and it said that there were going to be these new lockdowns, tier 3 as it was called, and that they were going to be in the areas with the highest infection rates. And by that stage, just a week on, the highest in the whole country was the Liverpool City region. And it specifically highlighted one area in it, and that was the Liverpool City region. So we knew what the government's plans were. So we tactically then said, okay, if we are definitely going to go into this tier 3, this highest tier, what are the things that we'll need to argue for? And of course, we tried to see whether we could get a financial package of business support, but also we were looking at what the individual restrictions would mean to different parts of the economy. And when we were the first, obviously, to go into those meetings, and we had some that was with a whole host of different number 10 advisors and with the leaders, and it just became ridiculously cumbersome. So it ended up with slimming that down to basically one chief executive, myself, Ed Lister from number 10, and then sometimes the Prime Minister. So it came down to a very small number of us. And what I negotiated was basically, it's still the best deal in the country. I got the first tranche of money from the old tier 2 and said, oh, no, that's nothing to do with what we're talking about here. So we banked that. So we had that. And then we got an agreement and a parity clause that meant that subsequently, if any other area got a better deal on paper, that we would get an automatic uplift. So I knew we couldn't lose out on the business support side of it. And then we had to look at the individual restrictions, and what they said was that this was the suite that was going to go through legislation. When we were talking to them, there wasn't even an act. It hadn't even started to go through the parliamentary processes. That wasn't until the Monday. So on the Monday, we were looking very carefully at what happened. Tuesday, Wednesday, goes through Parliament. And as I say, we were the first. Then about 4 or 5 days later, Lancashire get it. And their restrictions were slightly different than ours, and they didn't close gyms. And that was the start of the unravelling for me of what happened on tiers with national government. They should have just said, it's the same for everybody. But somehow they negotiated something that we were told was a red line. And so then I went into negotiations with government again to take gyms out of the restrictions. You remember all this. And it takes a lot of time and effort, to tell you the truth. And I had to go through primary legislation. You actually, once something's in the Act, it's in the Act, and you can't just decide on that. So we did all that. But what I think, tactically did, Frank, was to look at what the long-term prognosis would be economically for the city region. And we knew with because we'd seen all the graphs and the epi curves and all that, where we were going to be in 8 weeks' time, because that's what I was looking at. And 8 weeks' time for me was what they call the golden month, as we know now, in the run-up to Christmas. And that's where most of our businesses in the Liverpool City region and the visitor economy, they make a third of their profits. And we'd calculated that if we did things in a certain way, we could actually be out of the tier 3 back down and opening up the economy. And actually what happened was all of that is true, except there was, in the intervening period, there was a national lockdown, which we didn't know about. But that didn't really stop what we were doing. It meant that we came out into tier 2. The problem was because we'd been in lockdown, our numbers were really low, and we went into tier 2, but we're surrounded by tier 4s. And we were like a little island, a little oasis where everybody went, well, I can't go for a bevy where I am, can't go for a meal where I am, can't go shopping where I am. I guess what? And they flooded in. And we were saying to the Secretary of State, we need a bit of help here, because if that's the case, we welcome their money, but with them, there's likely to be people who are positive, and we'll see the increase in infection rates after Christmas, which is exactly what happened, alongside the fact that the government stupidly opened up everything, didn't they, and said, you got those 5 days originally, then it was 3 days, and you can go and see all your elderly parents and give them COVID for Christmas. So that was the backdrop, Frank, and as I say, I look back now, and as you just alluded to there, we were right. We had everything spot on. What let us down was the government in action.
I think the other thing, though, Steve, that just in terms of, casting our minds back, and you surprised me when you said it was September. It's as I say, it's the months are just merging into one, unfortunately, at the moment. Is that there's been so much mixed messaging, hasn't there, from government, and therefore, I think the seriousness of the situation around infection rates at that time probably wasn't appreciated by many. I think that the messaging coming out from certainly certain ministers within government, not least the Chancellor, was that we couldn't afford any more lockdowns or restrictions, and we had to start to see an opening up. And then, of course, really surprising, but perhaps nothing should surprise us at this moment in time, given what's happened during the pandemic. We actually have a Conservative Prime Minister name-checking a Liverpool Mayor, which must be a first as well. And, I can joke about it now, Steve, but I'm sure that caused you some issues in a sense. Now, listen, for me, as a business owner in the city and someone that's always encouraged Liverpool to have a more positive and constructive relationship with government of whatever colour, because whether we like it or not, they hold the purse strings and we've got to have a relationship with them. I equally know how sensitive party members, activists, and let's face it, our city is to that Tory brand. And so how difficult was that for you? Or was it just something you thought, well, listen, I'm taking that on the chin because I know that in the medium to long term, this is going to play out well for us?
I was really conscious, Frank, that when I was an MP, I think I've told you this story, but I was walking down genuinely the corridors of power, and I was going into a room, but I was about 5 minutes early. And I heard a conversation because the door was ajar, and it was some people who didn't know, but later it transpired that one of them was a senior Tory and some civil servants. And they were literally slaughtering Liverpool. And that, when your ear picks up, and I was like, what's that about? And it was about Liverpool. And they were basically saying, typical Liverpool, coming down here with the beg and bowl, as if nowhere else in the country is being hit and all that sort of stuff. So I was very conscious that I wanted to change the misperceptions of what the Liverpool City region was about. Hence, whenever we've gone down to Westminster, I've made certain that there's a properly evidenced business case for an investment opportunity for UK PLC. Rather than just saying, give some money, I've gone, do you know what? If you invest in our area, look what you get as a return. And that's what we did on the recovery plan, £1.5 billion. But basically we said, for a country, we'll get £9 billion worth of economic benefit in return on this. So I was trying, if you like, to repair some of that damage that's been done as a legacy of many decades. But also, you're right, I have to be very cognizant of the fact that I'm proudly a member of the Labour Party. I love the Labour Party. I've been campaigning, literally leafleting since I was 9 years of age for the Labour Party. So I'm steeped in it, and it's in my DNA, and I genuinely love it. And I describe myself unashamedly as a socialist, but I'm a pragmatist as well. And you can't do some of the nice things that you need to do unless you can get government to support the things that you want to do. And that means that you have to have that evidence-based approach. So I was very aware that it might backfire locally, but I thought, I need to do this for the greater good. First thing we needed to do is protect lives. People were going to die. There's no doubt about it. If we had done nothing, I know that our death rate in our area would have been much higher than it already is, and it's already in a terribly poor and parlous state. So that was the first thing. How many of us who are brain surgeons or work in the NHS can say they've saved lives? I can. I know that I saved lives. So that makes me sleep okay. The downside of it, of course, was social media and the sort of death threats and all that sort of stuff that came. And the fact that my family, we had to have 24-hour police protection for nearly 2 weeks and all that sort of stuff. I think those threats are not little bits of banter on social media. I had a colleague, an MP, who died because it wasn't taken seriously. That these idiots can turn from sort of keyboard warriors into people who then go out and, we lost Joe Cox and people remember that incident, but there's plenty of others, who've escaped sort of those, the physical attacks, but there've been the threats of them. So I was a bit peed off about all that. And it was purely because Number 10 had decided that they wanted to try and shut Andy Burnham up. And then they wanted to use a patsy as they saw it. And they thought that they could divide me and Andy and that we'd fall out with each other because we'd, had very different approaches. Andy had been in lockdown for 9 weeks, full lockdown, and was saying, we don't need more stringent restrictions. We need another way of doing things. Whereas we knew that we needed more stringent restrictions and a lockdown. So we started at very different places and did the right things that we saw for our areas. And I speak to him all the time. In fact, it's just been on a trade delegation with him now. And when we talk, he says to me, well, look, I would have done what you did. And I say to him, well, I would have done what you did if the things had been reversed, if we had been in the same situation as Manchester found themselves in and vice versa. So there's all of that as the backdrop, Frank. But sometimes you have to be a little bit courageous in leadership. Good leadership is about being brave. It wasn't just me. It was the 6 leaders of the local authorities, and 2 of those were really new. And I thought that they're the remarkable ones. Jeanette Williamson over on the Wirral was steadfast. She absolutely thought this is the right thing to do. We need to protect lives, save lives, and then protect our businesses as well. That was the approach. It was a 2-pronged approach. And I just think that some of them really stood up during that very, very difficult period for us all.
And you did mention yourself, Steve, that the government in its infinite wisdom decided to make Liverpool a tier 2 area, which we all welcomed at the time. The hospitality sector in particular was needing that boost because, as you've rightly pointed out, a third of its takings come from that sort of Christmas period run up to it. But then everywhere else went into tier 4. So it mitigated against the objective in a sense. And you didn't need to be a rocket scientist to know that our hotels, our bars, our restaurants would be full of people from Manchester, from Birmingham, from London. And so we've ended up back into a national lockdown. As we move forward, Steve, and you're having conversations, I'm sure, on a daily basis with officials now, I would hope those lessons have been learnt and we won't be going into any form of tiered system again because, it's simply proven that can't work. You can't put a wall around Liverpool and say, well, we're going to keep everyone from Manchester out. So are those conversations that are happening taking account of that experience that we had over the Christmas period?
It's a really insightful analysis of what is currently happening at the moment, where we're trying to say to governments that tiers are a blunt instrument, and people go, well, that's very good of you to say it because that's hindsight. It's not. No. I'm on record back in September before we entered into this to say, we'll do it, but tiers are a blunt instrument. That was the exact words that he used. And basically that's because of what you just said. It's like, we haven't got borders. I mean, people were saying to me, genuinely, why don't you stop people from Manchester getting on the Wigan train, coming through Kirby into Liverpool? And I just, how, what powers have we got? The Scouse Border Patrol was out and they couldn't catch them. Plus the fact is that it was essential travel only, and people had to demonstrate, if they were stopped, that it was essential travel. So that was the way that the police could get involved, because they're the only ones who can enact enforcement of legislation. So it was crazy times when we were so obviously trying to say to governments, we need a little bit of assistance here. All they did is try to reinforce messages for us. But I think the tiers thing is at its day. And if we were to come out of lockdown and then have that sort of mishmash of different areas, we're going to see the exact same thing again. And we'll see, because this new variant is much more transmissible, we'll see those areas that have got attractions such as our visitor economy that we're rightly proud of, but it does attract people in from outside. And again, you're going to see more and more people coming in, and that will increase the numbers. So for me, our big hope is the vaccine program. That's the conversations that I'm having with the Secretary of State to say, because we had mass testing, and by the way, mass testing didn't just happen. That was myself and Tony Reeves who spoke to the Prime Minister and Ed Lister and others and said, we can do this. And if you're looking at a pilot, don't go to Manchester all the time. Have a look at what we can do. So we were the first in the country that had mass testing. Now, the reason that we wanted mass testing was because we knew that there was going to be a vaccine. And we said, we'll then build the logistical capabilities within the city region and the partnership working that you have to have of all the multi agencies. And that puts us in the best place then for mass vaccination, because we thought, let's think ahead, which is true. When the vaccinations started, again, we battered it. We literally had everybody all working together, and we could get them out. If they doubled the supply, we could still get stuff out. The problem is that because we were so successful, and if you have a look at our latest figures, we're in the high 90s now of the first priority group, and then it drops down, but we're still, I think, overall about 90% of the first 4 priority groups, which is remarkable, really. But if you look at what they've done, they've then said, we need to look at other areas where they've been slower and give them the opportunity to catch up. And that, I understand the argument that why everybody should get it, but that really does mean that we're all going to travel at the slowest rate, aren't we? And actually what we should be doing is try to see whether we can give additional support to the ones who are behind, not just vaccines, so that they can come up as well and that we can all really take off. And in regard to supply on the Pfizer one, it looks like WHO and certainly lots of countries are saying that for the older age group, then it might be better to go with the OAZ one. If that's the case, there should be more supply, because they're still producing the amount that they thought they were going to sell to all these other countries. So I've said we'll have them.
Yeah,
we'll have them. We'll get people vaccinated more quickly because we have the infrastructure, and that came as a direct result of the action that we took.
So, Steve, if we anticipate that the government have learned the lesson about the tier systems, you've referenced there that Liverpool really did step to the front, and again, a courageous decision. Many people criticised Liverpool for taking that decision to undertake a mass testing system. It proved to be hugely successful. And I can point to other examples that you will be aware of across the country where local authority or combined authority-led initiatives have been far more effective than anything that the government have tried to impose from a national level. Has there been any acceptance of those lessons from government? Are you hearing from ministers or from officials in Westminster actually what we've got to start to seriously look at now is how we can devolve these initiatives to combined authorities, city regions, so we can get these things done more efficiently, more quickly.
I think if they have learned lessons, it's kicking and screaming, and it's not because they've identified how poor they were. They still believe that they're brilliant. And if you just look at test and trace, for instance, what an absolute farce that was when it was nationally controlled. The data was poor. In fact, what they did is they provided, eventually when they sort of moved towards a more localized delivery model, they provided some of the data that they were going off. And no wonder they couldn't trace people, because they'd missed a digit off the phone numbers. So these people were just trying to phone people and they were all dead. Well, I guess why they were dead, because if you count the digits, there weren't enough of them. Nobody spotted that at a national level. So that's why it was really, really poor, the uptake of things like that. So the quality of data was bad. The way in which nationally you had people who were just phoning from anywhere in the country, but not understanding the peculiarities of a certain area. And in all honesty, I'm not just saying this, but, you know, Scousers are a bit like that. We're a bit chippy at times, and you know, so they didn't fully appreciate that. I'm sure that it's the same that there's traits elsewhere. But when it came over to us, we didn't just have people phoning from a centre. People went and knocked on doors, and that's how you sort of get the messaging over, because there were two issues, Frank, that we identified again, going back 4 months or more. So we were told anecdotally several times by people that they had been contacted through National Test and Trace and asked who they'd been in contact with, you know, so they can get the infection chain. And they'd refused to tell them because at that stage, if they did, then that person would be contacted and they'd be told to self-isolate for 14 days at the time. But lots of these people never had a pot to pee in. Yeah. They were literally at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder and on, you know, sort of living wage rates. And it was, for them, it was a decision on whether to blow the mate up and say, you know, oh yeah, I was with Jimmy. And then Jimmy's told, don't go to work. But by not going to work, they couldn't put food on the table, or they were going to go into rent arrears, or, you know, they couldn't heat their homes and all that sort of stuff. So we said to government, you need to do something. And they steadfastly refused. So me and Burnham did the joint press conference, and we literally were on wall-to-wall telly saying, this is what we're telling you. This is your warning. You need a self-isolation grant for these people. And of course, they belatedly introduced it. And that's part of the problem with this government. They're just so pig-headed that even when you're trying to be helpful behind the scenes, they won't do it until there's a big blow-up. You've seen it with Marcus Rashford and others. That's all they respond to. And we eventually got this self-isolation grant. Now, the problem that we currently have is that those factors are still in play, except that this thing, isn't it, called self-isolation payments. The problem is that the government have made it so onerous for local authorities to distribute it that in Liverpool, 75% of applications have been rejected. So again, what we're doing, and 66 in the other areas, people are just saying, I'm not telling you who I've been in contact with, because beforehand, you were going to get 500 quid for the fortnight that you're off. Now, people know that they're not going to get it. And so we're going to repeat the mistakes that we previously had, because if we do stop people from going out, and I do know it's a national lockdown, but we're talking about mainly people who might have been in sort of what was called manual jobs, you know, where transmission is more likely. And unless we stop those people, then we're still going to see that residual downward curve, and we won't be as low as other areas in the country. So there's every likelihood that it could take off again. We need to get it to really its lowest point, which gives us the hope for vaccines, doesn't it? Fingers crossed.
Yeah. So just your analysis there of the government there, I think it'd be difficult even for its strongest supporters to argue against. it does seem to be a government that's led by headlines, that reacts to things rather than being proactive and ahead of the game. But of course, I think it's a government that's very politically aware, and they got to power last December, really with a promise for a levelling up agenda and winning what was described as red wall seats. Here's my fear, Steve. With the best will in the world, and even with boundary changes that are planned, there's not going to be many Tory MPs for them in this part of the world. We've put together a fantastic recovery plan. Seen the plan, I've been consulted about it. I think it's ambitious, it's aspirational, it can absolutely evidence that it will contribute to UK PLC's future economic growth. Are you fearful that despite the fact that, as you mentioned earlier, you've got a pragmatic approach and you have got constructive relationships with some people within the corridors of power, and let's not forget, it's not always politician to politician. There's many officials that I know you have to deal with because that's the nature of the game. Are you fearful that we may be moving to a situation where money is invested for political reasons rather than those evidence-based projects that, you know, are the things that are not going to just drive our economy, but actually drive the economy of the country forward faster?
It's an interesting question, Frank, because my complaint to Bayes was that the government announced this new levelling up fund, they called it. And for me, that's exactly what they should be doing. And so you'd hope that it does what it says on the tin, but it's not. It's anything but. In fact, they've turned it into a beauty contest where Tory MPs can sponsor projects in their area, and that gives them a bump up. And that is not levelling up. Levelling up, of course, means that those areas that have been left behind need to be addressed first. So we will be competing and have been competing already against, you know, these other people in a beauty contest, when we know that because they're from a different political persuasion, that they will get more favourable treatment within the political corridors of power, even though civil servants are supposed to act quite rightly. They should act impartially. But they obviously, like we all do, they respond to their masters, who are the politicians. So it's, I think, £4.5 billion. Only 600 million of it was going to be allocated this year anyway. We asked for 1.5 billion. So it's only less than half of what we asked for anyway. But they're going to distribute that to the whole country, and we've all got to bid in for it. Now, people might think, well, you know, that's what you have to do, bid in. But it takes a lot of time and effort and resource to continually bid in for stuff. And that's part of the problem. Devolution is about giving areas a fair share and then saying to them, now get on with it. And if you get it wrong, by the way, you're going to be standing in front of the electorate in 3-4 years' time, and they'll kick you out if you've done a bad job. That's what devolution should be really about. What we have is far too much decentralisation. And like this pot now is about delegated pots of money to areas rather than really trying to level up the economy. And again, just to re-emphasise something I always say, we are still the most centralised political democracy in the OECD, and we have the most unbalanced economy in the whole of Europe. And something needs to happen to address that, because red wall or not, those areas that believe they've been left further and further behind, them votes are going to stay with the Tories very long. So they need to address it, if not for the right and moral and ethical purposes, for political purposes anyway.
Despite those challenges, Steve, I think, you know, if you look at what the combined authority and other local authority leaders in the city region have been doing past 9 months, we have been proactive here. We have been nimble. I think if you look at the way in which our grants have been distributed to businesses, for example, I think we were the first to introduce discretionary grants. I think you authorised for SIF funding. We won't go into the complications of all these things, but that was money that you've been awarded by the government, and you said, well, yeah, that's great for our strategic plans, but we need help into our business community and into our economy now, and that was done. And then, as I say, you've produced this fabulous economic recovery plan. If people have not seen it, go onto the website of the Combined Authority. I think it's there for people to view, and some great aspirations and ambitions there. But I think the other thing that you've recognised, Steve, and I think Andy, I'm sure Andy's on the same page, is that we can't simply rely on the government and potentially get grants from them. So you are looking at other partnerships, developing conversations with partners, both at a local and regional level, but also, of course, nationally, internationally. And you briefly referenced a meeting you've been on this morning. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that and the collaboration with Greater Manchester as far as that's concerned?
Yeah, again, I'll probably tell people, as I always tend to do, things that Burnham says, why are you straying into that? But when we were both MPs, we didn't get involved in the sort of the Westminster cliques or the dinner parties or anything like that, and we didn't go to strangers bars or strangers bar in Westminster in the House of Parliament. But occasionally, after a sort of heavy day, we'd go off and find a pub that was sort of equidistant between where he was staying and where I was staying, and we started to talk about it was at that time it was Manchester and Liverpool. And Andy, whilst he was born in Aintree, spent most of his life in Greater Manchester. And his music, his Manchester taste, everything but his clobber is certainly Manchester. But everything other than his football team, which, he's chosen the wrong one, but everything's from that end of the M62. So we were saying, just imagine if you could bring them together, the two areas together. And then obviously devolution came up and they said you have to have a Metro Mayor. So we said, just imagine if we both got those jobs, what could we do? And that was like 5 years ago. Now we're doing it. In fact, I'd say that on most things, there's about 80%, because we were trying to quantify it before, about 80% alignment between what we're doing. The other 20%, we do compete against each other. You've just heard that this level and up fund, well, I'm going for some of that and they're going to go for it, and that's fine. But we're trying to get away from the tribal rivalries, and where there is that sort of competitive rivalry, that's fine. And we just have done a trade delegation now with Ireland. So there's the deputy, it's called a Turner Stay or something, deputy prime minister, the trade minister, the Irish ambassador, and something called Enterprise Ireland, and ourselves, myself and Andy. And we're going to have the first ever joint delegation that's sponsored by UK government to Ireland. It's never happened anywhere else, never mind Ireland. So we're going and saying, this is huge for both of us. And I keep on saying that there is complementarity between what Manchester have got and what Liverpool City Region's got. And say that they've got an international airport and we've got an international global seaport. They've got a few out of town shopping centres. We've got culture and the visitor economy. There are some similarities and some differences between what we've got, but actually together, really, really powerful. Collectively, we're nearly as big as Scotland. Mm. That's how big Greater Manchester and Liverpool City Region is, population-wise, GDP-wise, GVA, all of the sort of indicators, hugely important. So that's where we're trying to go, because when we're competing, I'm talking about on an international and a global scale, it doesn't really make sense for Manchester or Greater Manchester even to go for stuff, or for Liverpool or the Liverpool City Region to go for stuff. Sometimes, like China, they don't just want us two. They want the whole sort of northern powerhouse. They want nearly 60.5 million people, because that's the sort of scale that they want to deal with. So when it's local, we do local. We can do it, individual local authority level. We can do it us two working together, and then we'll grow it as we need to when the scale is important to the people that we're pitching to, and it's starting to really pay dividends. And we're hoping that there'll be some really good news and some announcements that we'll make following the physical delegation that goes out later in the year.
Really positive stuff, Steve. And just listen, your challenges over the next few years are going to be huge post-pandemic, because we've been looking at the whole agenda over the last 9 months through the lens of COVID and infections, and you'll be as aware as anyone that alongside that now we're building up an awful lot of other social and health issues that are going to have to be tackled. Mental health, unemployment and joblessness, which we've seen far too much of in this part of the world in the past, and then a potential economic downturn as well. Taking aside, given the fact that we've got predominantly a business audience here today, Steve, those social issues, which I know you're going to play a comprehensive role in trying to address, what are the sort of things that we're thinking about in terms of getting our economy rocking and rolling again and bouncing back?
Well, there's going to have to be much more working together. I've just been speaking to an Irish audience. By the way, there were 400 chief executives or FDs on that call. That's always allowed to go on it. You weren't allowed to pass it down. So that's a really decent audience to pitch to. What we need is more collaborative work and trying to pull the Liverpool City region genuinely together. So that's a big aim for us. But economic recovery for us will give us an opportunity to do things slightly differently. I want to do things very differently, but I'm a big believer that you're better with evolution than revolution. So the way in which we want to evolve that is, for instance, we launched our Fair Employment Charter this week, one day this week. And that is a partnership. That's saying to employers, we want to work with you and we want you to work with your workforces, because the way in which you get productivity increases is by treating people appropriately. And we, for instance, have got huge chunks of money, and you mentioned some of it before, Frank. We were the first in the country to give out some funding to the forgotten and the excluded groups, and still are the only group we've done that, where we even give money out to taxi drivers. All you can imagine, the taxi drivers are saying it's not enough, but there you go. We're trying our best. The sort of build back better that we talked about wasn't just meant to be a catchphrase. It was actually then misappropriated by Boris Johnson because they used it. But also, I think more appropriate was the use by Biden in the American elections, so that they started to coin it. It wasn't mine or Burnham's phrase in the first place. It was actually from the post earthquake in Japan, when they said they wanted to build things back better. So they were talking about physical infrastructure. When we were talking about it, we were talking about an economic and a social infrastructure. We can build things better. The very fact that, I don't know how many of you have done this, but I know more of my neighbours now than at any time since I've been here, and I've been here 31 years. And over this period, just saying to everyone, we're going to shops, do you want anything, and all that, going out and clapping for the NHS, that's about social cohesion. So you can build back better. The fact that we didn't sanction people during this period or evict them, that's building back better. They're the things that I think you can do. There's a different approach that you can have to treating people, and there are economic benefits from doing that, and you can get a bigger bang for your buck. So that's, for me, where we need to go. And I want the Liverpool City region to be the best place to live, of course, but to also to work at and to run a business in. So we want to provide the ecosystem and the the support mechanisms for businesses to thrive in the city region. We want more good businesses to come and set up here, because we believe that, you know, that partnership work and will pay dividends, and hopefully we won't go back to what we saw, what we lived through, Frank, in the 80s, when, you know, being from Liverpool and trying to find work in Liverpool was very, very difficult.
Absolutely. Steve, I've got probably another 20 questions that I could ask you, because, you know, it's been a fascinating conversation. And as always, you've been very candid in your responses, but I'm aware that people want to come in and just put a comment or a question or two to you. So Robbie Blackhurst, Robbie, good to see you, mate. Do you want to put your question to Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Hi, Steve. Just a quick one, really, in terms of obviously Liverpool City region being the mass testing guinea pig, which you referred to earlier, and obviously we're held up as exemplar in our approach to delivering the mass testing. So when the tier systems were getting dished out, and obviously, you know, you mentioned about Liverpool being an island in the middle of a load of tier 4s or tier 3s, can't remember at the time, which is true. Do you think the central government kind of had to put us in a lower tier than the other regions, regardless of the data? Because wouldn't there have been political suicide to hold Liverpool up as an exemplar in terms of mass testing? Suddenly wants to roll out in other regions, but then the benefit of that is to shove us in tier 3 or 4 with the other regions. So it's kind of, you know, regardless of the data at that point in time, do you think we would have always been in a lower tier than our obviously peers over in Greater Manchester?
I think there were claims at the time, wasn't there, that other areas had been disadvantaged because of what had happened in Liverpool. So that was the argument I think that government may well have kowtowed to. But they didn't acquiesce, and that's because the data quite clearly showed all of the indicators on a downward trend. That's where we were trying to get to. That, as I say, that modelling that we'd done previously showed just, I mean, it was about 90-odd% accurate. You know, it was really, really good that the Public Health England's people did. But we saw where all the trends were going. So we knew that we were there. It would have been impossible for them on the data to have done it. But you're right. They were under increasing pressure politically, I would have thought, because of the way in which they tried to divide myself and Andy and Liverpool and Greater Manchester. They tried to do that, and it didn't work. I mean, more fool for Boris Johnson not to pick up the phone to one of his, you know, people who understand this part of the world and said, listen, we're thinking about trying to divide and conquer between Burnham and Rotheram. Do you think that's going to tactically work? Not understanding that we're not just two politicians from two areas in the north. We happen to be, you know, long-time busy mates. So, and by the way, who spoke to each other every single day when we were first in. So Andy was very much aware. And when he was trying to get more money, I was going, go ahead, lads, get as much as you possibly can, because I had my parity clause, which meant that I was going to get a bump up anyway. So we couldn't lose on it. And they didn't, you know, obviously government didn't know that, but the way in which tiers were operating was flawed almost from day one. I understood why the government thought that they could impose tiers on the north. But if you remember, when ours started to dissipate and the South's figures started to rise, that's when he went, oh my God, shit, what are we going to do here? Because they then were going to impose a higher tier in London and the southeast, and we would have been lower tiers. So they didn't. They went for a national lockdown, and they've done that twice now, so that they didn't have to face those accusations of political bias, which of course that's exactly the way it was. If you remember back in March, the reason that we went into national lockdown was because of what was happening in the south. We came out of it because we were later. We were at least 2 weeks behind here. We came out of it before we sort of bottomed out. And that's why we took off again, where the south took off. And if you have a look at all those curves, which we've got, you'll see there's an absolute pattern of government inaction that's causing problems here and trying to alleviate the problems that they had in London and the southeast, which they think is the epicenter of the world.
Thanks, Steve. Elaine?
I'll just unmute myself. I was just writing my question. Thanks, Steve, for all that you're doing. I think it's making a real difference. I thought about how we get our young people and adults back to school and college. What do you think the chances are of us being able to vaccinate? I mean, we had a fantastic opportunity, which the government's missed, which is half term next week, where we could have vaccinated our teachers and therefore with a view to be able to get our young people back to school and college, which, you know, the disadvantaged are becoming, as you know, the more disadvantaged the longer they're outside of learning. And also, you know, as much as we put our efforts into keeping our places safe, you know, I have literally having to bring in nearly 1,000 young people because they're disadvantaged in so many ways. And, you know, that's a more dangerous situation in terms of spreading infection. I know that's something that you personally would support, but what do you think the chances are in terms of this government moving on that?
I don't know the answer to the last bit, but there was a brilliant epigraph the other day on the Downing Street announcements, and if you had a look at it, it had the top 5 tiers, and then it broke it down, and there was a line in the middle between the genders, so men and women. And if you had a look at, and there was 2 colours that they use. I'm colourblind, but I could differentiate between them. And the middle bit was the people in hospital, and then the lighter colour on the outside was deaths. And within that top 5 cohorts, and nobody argues that they should have been prioritised, nobody. So within that, they could take out 83% of deaths and take about 40% out in hospitalizations. And that's because when they're in hospital, the older age group, they're in for a longer period, which is a good thing in some ways. And that is because our treatments are better. So those people would normally, unfortunately, have been in the group that had died, but they're not. And it's taken long COVID and long tail COVID has taken much longer. And so there are problems on that. But the death rate could be reduced exponentially. It was brilliant the way the graph quite clearly illustrated this. The next bit is the problematic area. And that is that when you've taken out all of that, where do you prioritize the next cohort? And they're just doing that on age. So basically, without a more sophisticated approach to this, you're going to have somebody who's 60 odd, sitting in that house, who's got a few bob, and able to work from home, you know, ad infinitum, or a 50-year-old or a 49-year-old who's not in the cohorts, who's having to go out every single day and put themselves more at risk because they've got a front-facing job where they're dealing with the public, or, you know, a porter in the hospital, or a taxi driver, or a teacher, or somebody who works in a supermarket. And I just think, yes, the top bit, no problems with that at all. But as you come down and you alleviate the pressure on the NHS, then it needs to be slightly more targeted and nuanced than it currently is, because all we do is go down in 5-year blocks of age. And actually that, in lots of ways, exacerbates the inequalities that we've got, because of areas like ours have more people who can't work from home, who are delivery drivers or whatever it might be, and they have to go out, and they'll be the ones without the vaccine protection who will still be getting sick, going into hospital, perhaps having long-term problems because of what we're seeing with some of the outcomes of COVID. So I'm arguing now for wherever we can to look at reducing things as much as we possibly can, but then for a line to be drawn and we say, yes, while we still prioritize these people, we will also include those other groups that fall outside of that top 9, I think it is, priorities, and they are the ones who are more frontline staff.
Thanks, Elaine. Thanks, Steve. Steve, I've just had a message from your boss, James, saying that you've got to be off this call by 11 because you've got another call. So we're certainly not going to get in the way of the rest of your day. But can I just say thanks for a fascinating contribution, as always, this afternoon. I think this is the first time on many, many occasions that you and I have spoke where it's me that's wanted to talk about football and not you. and sadly we haven't got time to do so. I'm still elated from the fantastic performance from Everton Football Club last night. But listen, just final thing from me, Steve, on behalf of the business community, and Elaine said this, you know, despite the dopes out there and the keyboard warriors, who we all have to put up with from time to time. And again, you know, if we had time, I'd talk about that fabulous campaign whilst you were in Parliament to try and get some regulation into the social media companies. And that's something we can return to another time, perhaps. But on behalf of the business community, thanks for what you and the team at the Combined Authority are doing. We do appreciate the support. And I can't wait to see you at a live event in the hopefully not too distant future, mate. And I'll buy you a pint or two.
Thanks all. Thanks for the time. Cheers, Frank.